On today's World Insight, Iran grapples with the fallout from the shot-down Ukrainian airliner. How can peace be restored at this critical juncture? And how will the Davos Forum reinvent itself for its 50th anniversary? I speak to David Eichmann, the World Economic Forum's Chief Representative Officer in China, to find out more.
Of their daily business and look over the horizon, lift their heads up out of the business and look to the longer term.
And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's begin today's show in Iran, where anti-government protests entered their third day. The demonstrations were in response to Iran unintentionally shooting down a passenger plane. Iran has since made arrests against those responsible. In the 10 days since the United States killed Iran's most powerful military commander in a drone strike, Tehran has faced pressure at home and abroad, both reaching levels with little precedent in its modern history. Before we get on to a discussion with stakeholders from different parts of the world, take a look at the latest.
Protests continue in Iran, but against whom? That keeps changing. Before Saturday, Iranians were united against America in their mourning of the assassinated General Soleimani. But outrage turned to their own government when the Iranian military admitted to have accidentally killed 176 innocent people on board a commercial flight from Tehran to Kiev. Despite apologies from authorities, anger has been exacerbated by the Iranian government's initial denial of shooting down the plane. The Ukrainian airline accident happened just hours after Iran had launched missiles at U.S. targets in Iraq, a retaliatory strike that resulted in no casualties. World leaders are calling for de-escalation, and European powers are working to somehow revive the nuclear deal which the U.S. abandoned, and Tehran has stopped abiding too. Ukraine, once again put under international spotlight, says the 5 nations whose citizens died in the crash will meet in London on Thursday to discuss possible legal action. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said on Monday that the victims would still be alive and at home with their families now if there had been no tension in the region.
For more on Iran downing of the Ukraine plane, we are joined by Mohsen Milani in Tampa. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and Professor of Politics from University of South Florida. In Washington, D.C., we have Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. In Beijing, Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First, I want to go to you, Professor Milani. With the arrest of a few dozens in Iran supposedly responsible for the attack on the passenger jet, do you think the mood of the country can be calmed down? Do you think criticism against Iran will somewhat reduced from the current circumstances, Professor?
Good day, and thank you for having me in your program. I think the arrest of a few individuals is the right step in the right direction, but the Islamic Republic has to go much further than that, because what we have seen in the past few days is the total collapse of public confidence in the way the government has managed that. They have made major egregious errors on every step of the way. They made a mistake by shooting down a civilian aircraft. It is clear that there are fundamental problems, systemic problems with the way the Iranian air defense system operates. They made a huge mistake in terms of informing the public about the incident. They should not have allowed any civilian aircraft to go off the Iranian airport when they already had attacked an American base in Iraq. And finally, for a few days, they were not honest with the Iranians. So the population, many Iranians feel that they were deceived, and they are angry, and the Islamic Republic did not even do a good job in terms of managing the grief people felt.
I see.
So the arrest is the right move on the right direction, but they have to do much more than that.
Mr. Ilan, from the U.S. perspective, of course, this is a crisis going on inside Iran. Do you think Washington take advantage of that? When taking advantage of the current situation, will that necessarily be gains, political gains for Washington, or likely more fire if not careful?
Well, I think the situation is still serious because I think Iran will retaliate, but Iran is basically this symbolic retaliation or ineffective retaliation that they did, which ultimately caused this tragedy, which I do think was accidental. And as your other guest said, it's totally incompetent on the part of the Iranian government. However, the military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran are not over. I think it's just moved to a playing field where the Iranians can have more advantage, that is indirect attacks on the U.S. targets through proxies in the Middle East. Now, as far as the shoot-down goes, I'm not sure they should arrest people because I think that the Iranian government's been so incompetent, not prohibiting civilian aircraft from going through this area when there was a confrontation between the U.S. and Iran, and also lying about it for 3 days. So I'm not sure arresting people is really the right thing. There certainly was failures in the aircraft identification area in their air defense system. There's no doubt about that. But it may not be the people's fault, and maybe the equipment or whatever. I don't know. But anyway, maybe they do deserve to be arrested, but I'm not quite sure. But it seems to be the whole system is broken.
All right. Mr. Lee, it's no doubt there were mistakes being committed by the Iranian side, shooting down the passenger plane, that's for sure. On the other hand, what do you make of the latest statements coming out by the Iranian president, Mr. Hassan Rouhani? And how do you think his comments, for example, the rest of the world is watching us as to how we are dealing with this, is creating some kind of discussion within the country of Iran, Mr. Lee?
I think, the Iranian government, certainly President Rouhani, has vehemently denied there's any cover-up or try any efforts to deceive the Iranian people to know exactly what happened that night. And he said, he received the reports from the army only, from the last, the Friday, almost, 3 days after that tragic events. And then, he openly, to admitted that this is a man-made, the error, and he apologize to all, the people on board as well as the Iranian people, and also he called for a kind of international and coordinating and to form or international kind of forms to investigate what exactly happened, and also to discuss what kind of and how much of the compensations will be paid for the people. And so far, I think people are waiting for this code of the black box, and there have been some the stories and also some speculations about the real causes of the Iranian army shoot down this plane. So my personal is that we have to be a little bit patient and do not jump any conclusion. Let's wait for I think the final results of this kind of investigation to see the real causes of these tragic events.
Okay. Professor Milani, the U.S. president has already identified himself with the protesters on the streets in Iran. However, people have also pointed out the two possibilities that this action or claim could run positively or negatively for the United States as well. Professor Milani, how do you see that?
Well, let's not mix a few issues. Number one, when the Americans killed Qasem Soleimani, a lot of people in Iran became very angry. It is true that the U.S. government considered the Revolutionary Guards a terrorist organization, and therefore their claim is that they have killed Qasem Soleimani, who was a terrorist. But to the Islamic Republic of Iran and to many people in Iran, Qasem Soleimani in reality was a uniformed general serving the Iranian armed forces. And therefore, when he was killed, it really made a lot of Iranians angry. I think Iranian nationalists, Iranian patriots were angry that America had killed a uniformed general. So millions of people poured into the streets. The opponent of the Islamic Republic claimed that the government was behind these demonstrations. I'm pretty sure the government was behind these demonstrations. But the past 40 years, they were never been able to bring so many people out to the streets. Yes, they were behind it, but there was also an authentic opposition to what the Americans did. And then came the shooting down of a Ukrainian aircraft. Your guest from Washington is absolutely correct. Iran most likely had made a mistake. As the other guest said, we have to be patient to find out exactly what has happened. But we don't have to be patient about one thing. The Iranian government lied to its people. It was a big mistake. They should have come out and should have admitted that they did this, but they're going to investigate. And now, as a result of that huge mistake, we are at a very critical juncture in Iranian-U.S. relationship.
So we see several things going on all at the same time. One, of course, is not necessarily the same nature of the other. One is the passenger jet, which is the problem of the Iranian side. The other is, of course, the killing of an Iranian general without notifying both the Congress and also the allies, and also doing it in a way that is against the norms of international rules. Then we also have a Iranian nuclear crisis going on at the same time. And now let's move on to that, which is very interesting, Mr. Eland. As we have seen the Europeans, UK, Germany, as well as France coming out and suggesting, let's push this to the UN, the United Nations, rather than the framework of JCPOA, which is going to be much more complicated than the current situation. Now, Mr. Eland, the U.S. is a member of the Permanent Five. However, the U.S. has long withdrawn from the treaty. Should the U.S. also be put to the United Nations together with the Iranians in this regard, Mr. Eland?
Well, I guess you could, but you know, with the veto power that the U.S. has, certainly I think the U.S. is to blame for all this to start, because after they went away from the agreement, they pulled out of the agreement, then we saw Iranian attacks on U.S. Facilities through these militias increase. Then, of course, the U.S. assassinated their second most powerful person in Iran. And then, of course, you got these anti-U.S. protests. But, of course, there had been anti-Iranian government protests before, so the U.S. kind of shot itself in the foot. As we see the Iranian population, this shoot down of the airliner was certainly bad, but this is only a symptom of the larger problem that the Iranian people have with their government. But the United States is getting in the way. When your adversary is having problems, you just stay out of it rather than diving in with both feet, as President Trump did by assassinating one of their leaders.
Okay, Mr. Eland, but my question directly is, you know, should we also punish those who have tried to withdraw from already agreed upon international treaties or agreement? In that case, what about the fate of the United States?
Well, you can.
Meanwhile, how should we make of, sir, Mr. Eland, the Europeans' reaction so far? It seems that it is adding oil to the fire at this moment, pushing it, the Iranian nuclear issue, to the United Nations, Mr. Eland.
Well, I think the Europeans are concerned that the whole thing is falling apart because of the Iranian reaction to the assassination. But of course, the agreement was already largely in big trouble anyway after the U.S. pulled out. And I don't think you can necessarily I guess you can condemn the U.S. for pulling out of it, but there's very little you can do else because the United States can pull out of the agreement and did, and so it's a great power, and so I disagree with the fact that the United States government pulled out, but I'm not sure, you know, the UN tends to be kind of feckless anyway, because any one of the powers, China, Russia, US, France, or Britain, who sit on the Security Council can veto anything they don't like.
Okay.
And so I'm not sure that's a good forum to place this. It can place additional pressure on the U.S. and Iran to get back to the table, and if it does that, then it's okay, I guess, but it's not going to achieve that much.
Mr. Lee, your assessment about that too?
I think, you know, so far the Europeans, I believe, has not made their final minds yet. You know, you can see on the one hand, the Europeans still made very clear that, you know, they want to preserve the JCPOA. They, you know, call for Iranian to return to the framework of the GCP to implement you know, the Iranians' obligations. But on the other hand, you know, the Europeans has give a kind of a warning to the Iranians. You know, if Iranians has not returned to what they should do according to the GCPOA, they would, you know, to bring this issue to the UN Security Council, and because you know we know that there is you know dispute mechanism, and which requires all parties to solve their problems or disputes within the 15 days. If they have not reached any solution yet, then you know the snapback of internal sanctions will be on Iranians. So you know this is a kind of a warning. But the Europeans are also very clear. Once you know the Iranians has been received in the international sanctions again, then it's the time of collapse of the GCPOA.
Okay. Money is an issue since you talk about sanctions. Whether it's money coming from oil or it's the money of the economy. Professor Milani, therefore, I want to come back to you and talk about, according to Iranian insurance company, the loss that's likely to be compensated will be as much as $150 million US, to say the least. Now, that's only according to one source. I do not know the exact number. We do not have it on the record right now. So, Professor Milani, how are we going to see Iran as a country be able to work on those issues from now on, as we have heard very strongly from countries that are having their citizens killed in the passenger jet crash?
Yes, Iran will have to pay compensation to the innocent victims of this tragedy. However, it's going to take many years before there could be a settlement. So Iran has a number of years to work on this project. Remember when the Americans accidentally shot down an Iranian civilian aircraft in the 1980s. It took many years before the U.S. was willing to pay compensation to the Iranians. So I think financially it's going to be very burdensome for Iran, but I think it is too early to talk about what kind of compensation we have to have. But may I just go back to the question you asked the other two distinguished guests about Article 7 of the nuclear deal with Iran. It is very important to point out that the Europeans, the three major European powers, have been insisting that they want to keep the JCPOA intact. They wanted to protect it. But unfortunately, they have not paid any political price for protecting this. And it is very clear that they are in complete alliance with the United States. The only two countries that helped protect the JCPOA, number one is China, and number two is Russia. And even if they succeed in the next 60 days, which is the period in which Iran has to negotiate with the Europeans, they might be able to snap back the European sanctions. But if it goes to the United Nations, I am not very sure that they can reimpose international sanctions. We already know that the British Prime Minister is already talking about a new Trump deal with Iran. So these next 60 days are going to be crucial, and I hope that somehow Iran and the global powers can come out with an agreement how to save the nuclear deal or how to come out with a new nuclear deal.
Things are getting ever more complicated. It's not just the early agreement, but also the complicated process to bring in all the stakeholders in a way as to where is the direction, particularly with the recent events. Now, Mr. Li, about China, I want to ask you about that. Since your Iranian guest particularly mentioned about China's role, what do you make, how would you assess exactly is the China role so far?
I think with regard to the JCPOA, China has played a very important role to, to manage, make the deal, to mediate between the United States and, the Iran at the time of the negotiations. But so far, I think, China, as we say that, we have implemented what we should do according to the JCPOA. But, the U.S. has, exercised maximum pressures on every country if they implement, if they have do any business with, the Iranians. And so we say that, what we do is, we may insist and, what China has to do is according to the UN resolutions as well as international agreements. We say, that both countries has the right to do business all together.
All right. Mr. Eland, now I don't want to make things too complicated, but sometimes geopolitics is complicated, unfortunately, and probably interestingly. So let me ask you this. China and U.S. have already designed a time to sign the first phase trade agreement later this week. Now, many scholars from both sides have been suggesting in terms of global governance, that when the two countries are working together on issues, the bilateral relations would even miraculously become better. So now, on the issue of Iran, since the U.S. is in quite an interesting position so far, particularly with the killing of the Iranian top general, will China and the U.S. have the possibility in an election year, which an international crisis is no good for any president in the U.S. history, will be able to work something together toward a common goal of making peace on the issue of Iran nuclear issue? Go ahead, sir, Mr. Eland.
Well, of course, I would like to see them go back to the negotiating table and get a new agreement, since the old one is apparently, dead. But I'm not sure, and I think China could help mediate that. But the problem is the escalation has happened already, and I'm afraid the Iranians are not going to be satisfied with the retaliation that they had, because, of course, this was a senior official in their government. And so I think that the Iranians may have an incentive to, and I think some of the Iranian officials have even said that they have an incentive to try to undermine Trump's election, as they did with Jimmy Carter back in the hostage crisis days of the late 70s. So, I don't think this Iran thing is going away, and that could have a serious impact if they can do that, if they can keep attacking U.S. targets.
We're running out of time. There are a lot to cover, even for 24 hours. During the day, there are a lot of interesting developments, to say the least. But for now, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me for this discussion. I'm sure we're going to have future opportunities to discuss more. Hossein Milani, Ivan Eland, and Li Guofu, thank you. You're watching World Insight. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. How will the Davos Forum, another year of Davos, World Economic Forum, in other words, reinvent itself for its 50th anniversary? I speak to David Aikman, the World Economic Forum's chief representative here in China, to find out more.